Many people view historical reenactors as a bunch of grown-ups who like to play dress-up, and that is just absolutely not, well, okay, that one might be a little bit true, but overall, this hobby is way more misunderstood than you probably realize. War reenacting has been around for centuries, and today there are hundreds of thousands of us across the globe recreating history, sharing stories from the past, and of course arguing about uniform details that nobody else cares about. For most people though, reenacting is this weird, obscure thing that you might only get a glimpse of at a local parade or from some nerd posting videos about it on YouTube. Plus, portrayals of reenactors in popular media are not always the most generous.
Reenactors gave them to us. Thankfully, most reenactors are fat as shit, you know?
I won't be covering whether or not that is true today, but I do have 5 very common misconceptions about the hobby that I'd love to dispel together. I'll be talking about World War II reenacting, since that's what I do, but I would guess a lot of this applies to reenacting other time periods as well. So let's get right to it, and we can just start with the most controversial one first. Why not? Number 1, reenactors truly believe in what they dress as. At reenactments, our goal is to accurately represent the past, and not just the parts that are politically correct or easy to talk about. This means that at reenactments, all sides are typically represented to give a more complete view of the past and to teach about the uniforms, equipment, and tactics of different militaries. Sometimes people see reenactors representing Axis countries and assume that surely those people must agree with what those countries did during World War II. Otherwise, why would they willingly wear the uniform of a country that's so widely known for committing heinous atrocities, like Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan? Sure, there are people out there who want to wear those uniforms for the wrong reasons, and in reenacting we often call them true believers. The classic example of that would be a real white supremacist who wants to reenact as a German soldier for political reasons. I stick to US reenacting, and I'm not as in touch with the Axis side of things, so I've never personally had any notable run-ins with these types of folks, at least not that I'm aware of, but from what I understand, people like this typically don't find a home in the hobby and get pushed out pretty quickly once their motives become clear. Reenactors who teach about controversial parts of history are already under a lot of scrutiny, and no reenactment group or event wants to be associated with real-life extremists. If they're coming around to push a political message and not to teach about the past and focus on historical accuracy, they're not going to last long, especially if they're trying to promote hate or glorify atrocities. I've heard plenty of stories about people like that getting kicked out of reenacting groups and events over the years. So why do some reenactors choose to represent these controversial militaries if it isn't an endorsement of their beliefs? Well, it could be for a number of reasons. First, a big part of reenacting is getting to understand the equipment used by a given military. One of my favorite parts of the hobby is getting hands-on experience with the same uniforms, weapons, vehicles, and other gear used on the front lines during the war. Many people are drawn to the equipment of certain militaries, like Germany, who objectively had some of the most interesting designs of World War II. Wanting to get hands-on experience with some of those items is enough for some people to take up German World War II reenacting. In other cases, some might just want to learn more about what soldiers in that particular military experience. Maybe they saw a movie about it or had a relative in that military or something that made them curious about what life was like for those soldiers. Some other reenactors just know that aspect of history is important to talk about and want to teach people about it. I'm sure we've all heard that saying, those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. Well, those dark parts of history are the things that are most important for us as a society to learn about so they don't get repeated. If teaching certain parts of history becomes taboo just because it deals with sensitive topics, that just means that less people will end up learning about those things. Now, of course, reenactors have to handle these topics sensitively and respectfully, but I think most normal adults should be able to tell the difference between someone wearing those uniforms to try to promote a political ideology and reenactors wearing those uniforms in a historical education context to try to teach people about the realities of the past. Just remember, context does matter. This is clearly an educational historical reenactment, and this is, I don't know what the hell that is. So in summary, you definitely should not assume that a historical reenactor's impression says anything about their personal or political ideologies. In fact, some of the most progressive reenactors I know reenact as German, Italian, and Japanese soldiers, and many of the reenactors who do those impressions reenact as Allied troops as well. Reenactors who are in this for the right reasons do it to spread history, not an ideology. This next one is one that unfortunately I've encountered numerous times. Number 2, reenactors do this instead of joining the real military or think reenacting is somehow akin to military service. That's right, you better thank me for my service. After all, I have given my life in countless reenacted battles over the years. This might sound crazy, but some people really do view reenactors in this way. In my experience, it's usually just people who don't know anything about reenacting and don't understand the historical component of the hobby. Which, the historical part is like the whole thing. I get comments on my reenactment videos from time to time saying things like, why don't all these guys just join the real military? Which completely misses the point. This is not something people do instead of enlisting. First off, many reenactors are or were in the military. As you guys know, I've never served, but many of my reenacting friends who you've probably seen in some of my reenactment videos are current and former military. It's not like it's one or the other. Many reenactors develop their interest in military history through their own military service, or maybe their interest in military history is what made them want to enlist in the first place. Also, reenacting is just a hobby for people who care about history and want to keep learning about it and sharing that knowledge with others. We don't do this because we think it's like a knockoff version of serving in the military. They're completely separate things. Believe it or not, people can want to better understand history without making a career out of military service. The two don't necessarily go together. This might seem unrelated, but bear with me for a second. I remember a few years ago, there was this trend on TikTok where security guards were essentially pretending to be police officers to get more support from their audiences. Understandably, that annoyed real law enforcement officers because these people were essentially pretending to do what they did just to get the sympathy and attention from their audience. I bring this up because I really do want to try to understand these people who make these complaints about reenactors. And I think in some cases, they kind of view reenactors in a similar way to those security guards who were trying to mislead people. Maybe in their minds, they think that we're using reenacting as some kind of like cheat code to make it seem like we're in the military without doing the job for real. But that line of thinking just doesn't hold up to even the slightest scrutiny. First off, nobody does this hobby to make people think we're in the military for real. After all, we're wearing 80-year-old uniforms and look nothing like modern soldiers. That would be a pretty terrible attempt at stolen valor. Also, we're doing this with an educational purpose. Sometimes I think people see a short clip of a battle reenactment online and think that's the whole hobby. They weren't there, so they didn't see us giving historical presentations and answering questions about our displays all day before that. They didn't hear the announcer explaining the significance of the battle and what's being recreated to the crowd before the reenactment started. They didn't see young kids at the event taking interest in what their great-grandpa did during the war for the first time, and they definitely didn't see the real-life World War II veterans in attendance being honored at the event. Reenactors aren't pretending this is real, and we'd never try to give anyone else that impression. Historical reenactments are an educational tool, not a performance meant to fool someone. These criticisms are also more often targeted at reenactors representing conflicts that are relatively more recent. Like, I've never heard of somebody going up to a Revolutionary War reenactor and saying, hey buddy, why don't you just go enlist in the army if you want to do that? Then you can wear that uniform for real. But that's the type of thing that some people say to World War II reenactors. I could be wrong about that though. I'm sure Rev War reenactors get the same types of yahoos. Let me know in the comments. All right, now let's get on to a misconception that we all wish was true, but sadly it isn't. Number 3. Reenactors get paid to do this or are provided their uniforms for events. No. But come on, how great would that be? In reality, not only do reenactors not get paid to do this, we actually pay a lot of money to be able to participate in this hobby. Almost every item you see at a reenactment, from a tent to a tank to a smoke grenade thrown in battle, was typically privately purchased by a reenactor who cares enough about the hobby to pour their hard-earned money into it. Reenactment events are typically put together by people in the reenactment community. They often need donations and sponsors just to cover their operating costs, so they definitely don't have the budget to hire us all as paid actors. Nobody's compensating us for showing up to these events and doing our thing. We're just in it for the love of the game. Few people outside of the hobby understand just how expensive reenacting can be. So let me give you a breakdown of some of the expenses that World War II reenactors typically encounter. Even if you knew coming into this video that reenacting was an expensive hobby, I think you'll be shocked by some of these numbers. Let's start with the reenacting basics, and keep in mind these costs vary widely depending on the details. This is just to give you some general reference points. First, you'll need a uniform. For a full historically accurate combat loadout, you'll typically need at least $1,000 to get started, although it isn't uncommon to spend 3 times that depending on the impression. Next, you'll generally need a weapon. For something simple like a US M1 Garand or carbine, you're looking at another $1,000 minimum, usually closer to $1,500. Then you'll need some ammo for that weapon. That cost will depend on the weapon you choose, but most rifle blanks cost between 50 cents and $1.25 per round. That adds up fast. Also, it costs money to travel to these events. You'll often hear reenactors make jokes like, oh, that event isn't too far from me in reenacting miles, it's only a 5-hour drive, because it's so typical to travel really far distances to go to some events. So already we're looking at least $2,000 for a basic reenacting setup, plus another $150 or so per event to cover ammo and transportation. That might sound kind of expensive, but that is the bare minimum. You'd be hard pressed to find a reenactor who's only spent that much money on the hobby. So with that baseline, let's get into some of the larger reenacting costs that most people don't even think about. Tents. At some of these bigger reenactments, you see hundreds of large military tents, and these often cost $1,000 to $2,000 each. Multiple impressions. Most reenactors don't just have one uniform. Many reenactors represent multiple time periods and militaries, and for each of those additional impressions, you'll probably end up spending another $2,000 to get the basics. I stick to reenacting one military and one time period, and still I have uniforms for different branches, dress uniforms, uniforms for different divisions and different theaters and campaigns, multiple weapon setups with the accompanying gear, specialized gear for medics, paratroopers, and other specific troops, and, well, you get the point. I have a lot of stuff. Displays. If you walk around a reenactment, you'll see tons of specialized displays representing different aspects of the war. And whether those displays are representing a communications post, an armory, or a field kitchen, that specialized equipment is extremely rare and expensive. Weapons. I mentioned that a basic rifle can cost as little as $1,000, but if you've ever seen one of these reenactments, then you know we do not just use basic rifles. A semi-automatic Browning automatic rifle, for example, is a pretty common sight at these events. One of those will run you about $7,800 brand new, and by the time you update it with the correct parts, buy a few magazines, and put a blank adapter on it, you'll probably have $9,000 into that weapon. And you still need to buy the ammunition. Machine guns like a Browning 1919 can run you anywhere from a few $1,000s for a semi-automatic version to $30,000 or more for a full auto version that's legal to own. I'll stop there, but just understand that when you see mortars, machine guns, or artillery pieces at reenactments, somebody spent some serious money on those things. Vehicles. Many reenactors own a World War II Jeep, truck, motorcycle, or some other type of military vehicle. These can range anywhere from around $15,000 for a Jeep to $75,000 or more for a World War II half-track. There are even reenactors who privately own World War II tanks, many of which cost more than $500,000 each. And those are just the cost to buy the vehicles. Whether you buy a Jeep or a tank, you'll end up having to put more money into it to cover maintenance and gas as well. So no, reenactors don't get paid to show up to these events, and we don't get supplied with our uniforms. We pour our disposable income into this stuff, mostly just because we think it's cool. With that in mind, if you guys want to help me be able to afford buying my own tank, go ahead and pick up some of my new channel merch using the YouTube merch shelf or the link in the description. I just launched a brand new merch line this week with 4 new t-shirts, some of which are available in youth sizes, which a few of you have been asking me about, and a new mug that looks like a World War II white phosphorus smoke grenade. This is the perfect gift for the history nerd in your life, and buying it helps support me and my work on this page. I only need to sell a few 100,000 more mugs to be able to afford a Sherman tank, so come on, help a brother out. All right, now let's move on to the next misconception. Number 4, reenactors stay in character the whole time they're reenacting. People are often surprised to learn that reenactors typically aren't in character as World War II soldiers at these events unless they're actively taking part in a battle reenactment. Even then, sometimes during these battles, we're making comments to each other that aren't what a soldier at the time would have been saying.
German mortar. That guy got hit by mortar.
Did he get hit by it?
Yeah. Yeah, it like bounced right on me.
Over there on the left?
I've found that in general, reenacting is much less LARPy than people think, but it does vary to an extent. There are 2 main types of reenactment events. There are public events, which are open to spectators and focus on educating people, and private tacticals, which are just for reenactors to experience soldier life more realistically. That difference does sometimes play a role in how in character people act. At tactical reenactments that are meant to be a bit more immersive, we do try to stay a little more in character throughout the event, but we still end up having normal conversations with each other. Of course, it is very common for us to talk about World War II history at these events. That's like the whole point. But we don't talk about it like it's happening right now. We talk about it like it's in the past. At least not usually. I have been at events where we try to kind of immerse ourselves in what's going on and only talk about period accurate topics. But in my experience, everyone gets sick of that pretty quickly and it doesn't last very long. At public reenactments, we are typically in character for the battle reenactment portion of the event because that's meant to be a show for the spectators. But during the portion of the event where we're interacting with people and telling them about who we're representing and what happened during the war and answering their questions, we're usually sharing info with them just like I'm doing right now. Yes, I'm wearing a World War II uniform, which helps people visualize what the soldiers would have looked like back then, but if somebody walked up to me at a reenactment and asked me how I got involved in this hobby, I wouldn't be like, hobby? I'd hardly call getting drafted into the army a hobby. I would just answer their question normally as myself. Okay, I might actually say that first part to try to get a laugh and then answer their question, but you get the point. Also, a big part of reenacting is the community. I've made so many close friends through reenacting, and when we're all hanging out at events, we don't limit our conversations to just period accurate topics. We talk about whatever we think is interesting, which is the same thing those soldiers would have been doing back in World War II. In a way, forming bonds with the guys in your foxhole and really getting to know each other is much more true to the World War II experience than having a fabricated conversation in character just to avoid saying something that isn't period correct. Alright, now let's get to the final misconception we'll dispel today, and this is a big one. Number 5. Reenactors have to represent impressions that align with their appearance. All the time I hear people say things like, I would love to do this, but I wouldn't fit in because I'm a woman or because I'm a certain race or something like that. Now, it's true that we try to represent the appearance of World War II soldiers as accurately as possible, but if we're talking about factors that are outside of your control, do not let that stop you from getting involved in this hobby. The most common question I get is, can women do this? And the answer is yes. Absolutely, 100%. Now, most of the female reenactors who I know choose to represent roles that were historically filled by women during World War II, which means that often they aren't doing combat impressions, although there were some militaries that had female combatants during the war. The US was not one of those militaries though, so if you wanted to represent a US nurse or a US Navy wave, for example, you would not be firing a weapon at the enemy during a battle reenactment. You would still be able to participate in historically correct ways though, and you'll be able to teach people about the important roles filled by women during World War II, which unfortunately are often overlooked today. If that's not your thing though, that's fine. Women can absolutely represent combat infantrymen and really any other role under the sun at these reenactments, regardless of whether they were historically filled by men. I know plenty of women who take part in combat reenactments and put together combat impressions that are on par with the best male reenactors. Just keep in mind you'll typically have to wear a men's uniform and you'll have to follow the same appearance guidelines that everyone in that role is expected to abide by. Grooming standards are a big part of those guidelines, so whether you're a man or woman, you'll need to at least appear to have a period correct men's haircut. If you're a female doing one of these impressions, you're essentially playing the role of a man, so if you have long hair, you'll need to either get it cut short in a period correct way, or I know some female reenactors with long hair who just tuck it up inside their hat or helmet, and you'd never even know looking at them that they don't have a men's military cut under there. Different events have different rules on whether you can tuck your hair up like that, so that's something I'd check on in advance, but definitely don't let something like that stop you from reenacting. After all, if US war correspondent Martha Gellhorn was able to disguise herself as a male soldier so she could cover the D-Day invasion, I don't see any issue with women today essentially doing the same thing at reenactments. Race is another one that people often ask about because during World War II, the US and many other militaries were segregated. But generally speaking, race isn't even a consideration at these reenactments. You do not need to be a certain race to do a certain impression. That's just not how it works. With that said, many reenactors do choose to represent impressions that align with their race, so they can use that as an opportunity to teach people about a group they're representing, but that is in no way a requirement or even an expectation. For example, if I wanted to put together a World War II Imperial Japanese Army impression, I could choose to base my impression around the white Soviet refugees who fought for the Japanese military. That could be a cool opportunity to teach people about a part of history that many people don't know about, but I could just as easily choose to represent a role that wasn't historically filled by people who look exactly like me. And there's nothing wrong with that. If that were the only thing off about my impression, that would mean I did a pretty great job. So basically, if you want to come and reenact, do it. Don't let those factors that we covered stop you from discovering a hobby that you might end up loving. Try to look up some reenactment events in your area, go there and see what you think, and then talk to some of the groups to see if they're recruiting new members. If you do that and you're a history nerd like me, you'll probably end up making some new friends and learning plenty of new things in the process. Thank you all so much for listening to me talk about my nerdy hobby today. I hope dispelling some of these misconceptions helps people understand reenacting just a little bit better. Make sure to subscribe to keep learning about World War II reenactments, and if you haven't seen the POV battle reenactment videos that I've posted, I would check out that playlist right after this video. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Remember, it's a war crime to detonate your white phosphorus mugs near civilians, and I'll see you in the next one.